Hey, welcome to our next episode or latest episode of Inside Look. And today we're going to be taking a little bit of a deep dive into eBPF. And if you don't know what that is, that's all right, because we're about to explain it to you. So my name is Douglas McKee. I'm the principal engineer and director of vulnerability research for Trellix. And here with me, I've got Rich.
Yep, I'm Richard Johnson, Senior Principal Researcher with Trellix Vulnerability Research Team, and just did a talk at Black Hat on eBPF for Windows, and excited to talk about it.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're here to talk about. I've got the DEF CON 30 shirt on. We all just came back from Vegas. Hopefully not too not too tired, but so, Rich, you gave a really interesting talk there about eBPF and where it's going on the Windows platform. For our viewers that might have no idea what that acronym stands for, could you kind of give us a little bit of an overview?
Sure. So the eBPF system is comes from a network packet filtering system called Berkeley Packet Filters. So that's the BPF part. And then the E is an extension of that. And so Berkeley packet filters have been around since the 90s. They're commonly used to do network packet filtering in firewalls and in common Linux tools like Wireshark or TCP dump. And then about 10 years ago or so, the Linux kernel started to use the same infrastructure for doing network packet filtering and extended that to being able to hook APIs on Linux and kernel for doing introspection and telemetry on systems. And this is evolving into the underlying platform that's starting to support all the EDR and telemetry systems and XDR systems that you're starting to encounter. Companies including VMware and a bunch of open source initiatives are putting this into their product. And as of the last year, we saw Microsoft take an interest, and they've now developed their own system for doing introspection and tracing and telemetry on top of eBPF.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to see how technology that's, I don't know, Rich, arguably what, maybe 10 years old now, it's really starting to pick up and being adopted more and more in the space.
Yeah, and there's always been a need for tracing and introspection on Linux platforms. It's been long supported with several other types of subsystems. There was dtrace and system tap, and ultimately a lot of these required custom kernel modules or extra setup. And eBPF is kind of unifying that need under a built-in platform. And BPF is quite complicated. It's a full virtual machine, and so it's a sandbox system. It's supposed to be providing security guarantees, and it really adds a lot of complexity to the system. And when this type of trusted system gets added to these kernel layers, that's why it was interesting to me. Number one, just to see that it's a unifying technology that's getting quick adoption, and it's now getting multi-platform adoption. And because it's a virtual machine, not a full system virtual machine, but a bytecode, much like JavaScript or Lua or something like that. The code that you write for eBPF is going to be portable across operating systems as well. And so what you end up seeing now is Microsoft has had to re-implement all the same APIs on the Windows platform. And of course, we know that Linux kernel is GPL licensed, and so they couldn't just simply lift and shift that same code. They had to go out and find some open source components that they've incorporated and add an additional layer to the Windows kernel itself to bring that compatibility together, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and anytime as researchers we hear like complexity and wide adoption, that always kind of perks our interest for places to look for vulnerabilities and bugs. At least I know it does for me. So, and that was part of your talk at Black Hat this year, was talking about the some vulnerabilities and bugs that you found. So, can you give us an overview of what you discovered during your research?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, we have seen, looking just at the Linux side first, the last several years, an uptick in the number of vulnerabilities being found in that implementation. And that's because, again, there's a virtual machine, a static analyzer, and then running custom code. And this is happening typically from a privileged user. On Linux, you do have to be root most of the time. But in general, so we've seen some historic attacks that already exist against this type of system. It's also being eBPF is finding its way into virtual currency platforms, and so if you look at Solidity in particular, that's also based on BPF. There's been some recent bug bounties there that's a very high dollar vulnerabilities there. And then so seeing it coming to the Windows side, knowing that it has to all be new code, it was interesting to look at and provided a good opportunity for us to also talk about fuzzing different layers of the stack, because the architecture is completely different. And so there's a userland library that allows you to talk to the new privileged interfaces. Then there's a service and a kernel driver communication layer via ioctls. And then, of course, there's the kernel driver itself that implements the hooks. And there's extension drivers that implement the network packet filtering at this point. And so all that being said, there's about 4 different major component spaces to look at, and we were able to leverage 3 different types of fuzzers in order to look for bugs. The result of that was that we did find a pretty severe arbitrary code execution vulnerability. If someone were to load a packet filter program that was available freely on the internet, then it could be compromised. And again, this is supposed to be in a secure environment with static analysis and a sandbox. And so this is a fairly significant impact, whereas the code should be trusted enough to be able to run third-party modules that come from vendors or open source community. So found vulnerabilities there. And then we also fuzzed the kernel layer, both with open source fuzzers WTF and also the KAFL Nix platform, hypervisor-based fuzzers. And we were able to find a number of potential vulnerabilities there. There were crashes and were able to cause denial of service on the system, do arbitrary kernel pool allocations, a number of things. Now, of course, these are privileged interfaces currently. So the vulnerability impact we were looking for was either that initial remote code execution or full code execution in the kernel context, because that would break driver signing enforcement. So we found a bunch of robustness type of errors, and we sent both the severest vulnerability and a number of the robustness vulnerabilities to Microsoft.
Yeah, it's absolutely great to be able to be looking at a technology as it's going into a platform, right, and finding vulnerabilities to help before there's, on the Windows side at least, so before there's huge adoption, to be able to help secure those.
Exactly. And historically, I've always been looking for these emerging technologies to be able to take a look at it before any of these vulnerabilities had a potential to really have a high impact in the deployed systems. Just this May was the first proof of concept that Microsoft released that ported over the Cilium load balancer. And so that was kind of their first real production grade program that they were able to run on top of the Windows eBPF. And so we're just seeing in the last few months that it's becoming production ready. And we wanted to get in there before, adoption began to be widespread, exposing, a whole new layer of attack surface to attackers. And so, I think we were very successful in doing that. And we also noticed during the same time that we were doing work, Microsoft started to add fuzzers on their side and were fixing bugs in tandem in the same time we were finding them. So we definitely were able to observe an increased maturity in their fuzzing and robustness testing for security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And you keep saying we, and you happen to mention in your Black Hat presentation that you had a little bit of help from some other interns on our team. Talk a little bit about how we leverage interns on the vulnerability research team and how they were able to add support to the eBPF research.
Absolutely. We had an opportunity to have a couple of interns this summer. And I always speak to we because any work that we do is really a team effort. But these two had a direct hand in the research that I did. We had Casimir Schultz, who was helping me out with writing multi-packet ioctl layer using snapshot fuzzing, really state-of-the-art work, and it's fantastic to have him helping. And also, I mentioned Nix and hypervisor level fuzzing. We are lucky enough this year to have Andrea Fioraldi, who's a world-class researcher and one of the developers of AFL++ and libAFL. So we have definitely world-class researchers working on these types of projects. And at Trellix, we are very lucky to be able to be working with these high-quality interns and to also, help um, bring some of their interests into Trellix and also be able to contribute back to some of their academic work as well. Give them time
That's
to work on some of those tools.
I find it really cool how we learn from each other. So a lot, oftentimes with interns, there's a lot of one directional learning where someone like yourself, who's senior on the team, is providing knowledge to the interns to progress their knowledge base. But it's really interesting when you've got some really awesome interns like we're lucky enough to have, that we get to learn a little bit from them as well, as we go through the process of fuzzing and working on these projects. So, we talk about being ahead of the curve and making sure that we're looking for vulnerabilities in an emerging technology. Um, Maybe give us, I know you plan on talking a little bit about this in some future conversations, but how do you see, or how do you think we see the threat actors going to leverage both BPF, the older technology, and now eBPF moving forward for malicious purposes? What is the concern level we should have as an industry of these technologies and focus for our security?
Right, because what we see is that ultimately when we have telemetry systems, they're more or less dual use interfaces, right? Defenders are going to use them to monitor your machines and try to find attackers and anomalous behavior. And of course, on the attacker's side, they tend to adopt these same interfaces for writing offensive tooling. And we've actually seen at Black Hat and DEF CON the last few years a number of red team oriented tools that we're exploring how to use eBPF on Linux to hide processes and more or less write rootkits and offensive capabilities using the eBPF platform. And what I find most interesting about that is that actually in the wild, we're currently seeing an uptick of BPF based malware being used in real offensive campaigns in Ukraine and China. And so I think they're using the precursor technology still, the classic BPF stack. And I'm exploring currently, what that's going to be looking like as they very probably migrate into the future to these eBPF platforms where they'll be able to write their rootkit once and then run it on multiple target platforms and use techniques that are currently being referred to as, some of the more sophisticated network command and control that they've seen out there. So we're trying to stay ahead of that and, envision what their future payloads are going to look like.
Absolutely. It's always this cat and mouse game between the red side and the blue side. It's interesting. You make the comment, from the blue side, we're going to be using this technology to monitor telemetry. And, my response is, so will the bad guys, right? If we can monitor it, they're going to try to monitor it too. And that's something that we need to be ready for as an industry, which is why researching this stuff before it's on every single Windows box ever created, that we have a way to move forward with it. A question that we get a lot on the team is how do we balance, like, you find a vuln like this, how are we able to balance reporting that to the vendor, but still continuing to do research? Like when do we choose to report these vulnerabilities? And I think for me, as someone that handles that quite a bit on the team, is we often really prioritize criticality, right, on when we report. And the more critical the bug, the faster we try to get it off to vendors to make sure that they have the appropriate time to patch and to get mitigations out there. But then we don't necessarily stop our research just because we've reported, one or two critical vulnerabilities, right? You and the team, Rich, have continued to take a look at eBPF and BPF on Windows moving forward a little bit, as even though we've reported some vulns. So I think that's a great process that we work through here at Trellix to make sure that we've that we're reporting vulns, but still continuing to do research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of the since we were fuzzing such a large target space with multiple components, of course, we had found certain crashes and things perhaps before we found our most severe bugs. But once we find something that's severe, we want to make sure that that gets handled appropriately and fixed as soon as possible, and and then also be cognizant of the load that we're putting on these developers, especially some of the components that they incorporated only had a single developers, and so when I initially fuzzed a few of the open source components, eBPF and Prevail Static Verifier, these are components that were developed independently by individual developers, and I had actually fuzzed those independently of the Microsoft platform, and it just coincidentally turned out that they were using those same components. And so initially, we didn't, of course, want to flood a open source project with a bunch of simple fuzzing crashes. So we waited until we understood the actual impacts in a consumer product that is going to be fully matured and developed, as opposed to an individual component that's providing an API. You still need to understand if those APIs are going to be accessible and what the attack surface is going to look like. And so I think this project was a good example of that, where as Microsoft's involvement increased, then they're now developing on those open source projects. They can help relieve the load of getting some of those bugs fixed. And so that's kind of, I think, how we handled that the best was we were able to submit the most severe bug directly to Microsoft when we realized the exposure that was there. And then also, yes, we're continuing to fuzz the components and report bugs that make sense, that have security impact.
Well, this has been great. I think we've had a good discussion on kind of high level what eBPF is and some of the research that we've done. I know we've got a blog out there, and of course, you can try to find some of Rich's presentation materials online as well. Do you have any upcoming talks, maybe, or presentations that you want to talk about, that you'll be talking about eBPF, that people could tune into?
Yes, actually. So in just a few weeks, I'll be in Sweden at SecT, and I'll be giving the Black Hat talk again. It was titled eBPF's Jumping Through the Windows. And also, I believe I'll be in Argentina in late October at Echo Party, and there, I believe, at both of them, I may be giving two talks because they have a local industry night besides the conference itself. And I had a talk that I gave on attack and defense with eBPF on Linux last fall at Tour Camp. So I have both the extra better program finagling talk, that's the Linux focused one, and I have this Windows one now, that's the eBPF else jumping through the windows, coming up at Echo Party and at SecT.
Fantastic. Well, I hope, I know I'll be interested to check some of those out. I hope maybe our viewers will get a chance to as well. I've had a great time speaking with you today, Rich. Hopefully our viewers have found this informative. Until next time, we'll sign off here. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
All right, great. Thanks.